welcome representatives of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, Mr Morgan, via video conference. For the Hansard record, could you please give your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
It's Benjamin Morgan and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association of Australia.
Thank you, Mr Morgan. I invite you to make a brief opening statement before the committee asks questions. Do you wish to make an opening statement?
I do.
Thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to testify today in front of this inquiry and to affirm that this inquiry is actually incredibly important. And it's important for a multitude of reasons, but none more important than the fact that Australia's general aviation industry right across this nation is in decline, and that decline is being driven primarily through decisions that have been made by the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, not decisions that are being made by the aviation industry itself. We find ourselves in a highly unique situation in which Australia's aviation industry is governed and run by a regulatory system which has been created to be vastly unique to Australia and does not mirror the framework of either our closest trading partner in New Zealand or the world's #1 general aviation economy, that is the United States and their US Federal Aviation Administration's framework. I would like to try and keep my presentation today at a simplified level and to try and use basic language in trying to explain the context of the challenge that we as an industry are facing. And we can start with the simple fact that right across Australia, we have a wholesale decline in access to flight training. Right across the general aviation industry, at virtually all corners of Australia, general aviation flight training has been in decline. And the reason general aviation flight training has been in decline is that CASA changed its regulations a number of years ago and made the process for an individual who is a certified licensed flight instructor to participate in their local community to teach people how to fly. That one fundamental change that removed the independent flight instructor out of regional communities right across this nation 25, 30 years later has resulted in the largest declines in general aviation, simply because if we're no longer teaching people how to fly, if we're no longer making access to learning to fly easy, and we restrict the number of outlets in which this can happen, people lose interest in aviation. And so private persons who would otherwise be involved in aviation simply are no longer taking part. Now that's one issue. A second issue is that as a result of a wind down of general aviation, we've also experienced declines in our general aviation maintenance and our supply line right throughout the industry. And today, we're in a situation where, according to BITRA, at the last survey period, some 3,300 VH-registered Australian aircraft in the general aviation categories from a total pool of registered aircraft of around 8,500 are no longer flying. And so when CASA says that it is successfully managing Australia's general aviation industry and that their regulations are responsive and that their regulations work, it flies directly in the face of the glaring data that shows that participation in general aviation is tanking. Now, I could spend, quite frankly, months talking about the various aspects of general aviation and why decline has deepened to the extent that it has. But unfortunately, this hearing today, we are extremely limited by the amount of time that we have. And so what I would like to do is I'd like to step through simply some of the points that we raise as things that need to be done in order to turn around Australia's general aviation industry, to get the aviation community moving again so that we can start to experience some growth and some prosperity. And ultimately, that's what this is about. And I would reflect back to some comments that have been made by McDermott Aviation, and that is nobody in this Australian aviation industry wants to be seen as CASA bashing, contrary to maybe the views of what CASA feel. I'm sure they do feel that the industry is highly critical of them, and I know that there are some misguided views that they think that we seem to enjoy this, but we don't. We want to see this industry work. We want to see this industry thrive. To do that, we need to get those independent flight instructors back into the system. We need to harness the passion and the dedication of the thousands of people still involved in aviation, and we need to get these aero clubs in regional communities back into the flight training spaces. We have a huge opportunity right now with thousands of airline pilots that are out of work to reskill and retask these people to get them involved in aviation again so that they can help create that bow wave of growth that we need. We need to address the maintenance regulations in this industry. There was a commitment from the Deputy Prime Minister back in 2018 that we would receive the Part 43 reforms, that these Part 43 reforms would form part of the reinvigoration of general aviation. It's 2020, we're at the completion of 2020, and the Part 43 reforms are still nowhere near delivered. We need to get these done. We need to look at private pilot medical certification processes. We need to end the decades of medical discrimination, and we need to end the decades of the abuse of the aviation industry by AVMED applying medical standards that are akin to passing an astronaut's medical test, nothing to do with flying a private light aircraft. We need to remove those hurdles to encourage more people in at these basic levels so that we can enhance the CASA recreational pilot licence and the CASA private pilot licensing system, returning people back into the system that have otherwise been forced out of aviation. We need to look at the categories that our general aviation light aircraft are classified in. The Canadians have some fantastic examples through their owner maintenance categories, where private aircraft can be declared owner maintained, removing some of the regulatory hurdles and empowering owners of aircraft to be able to work on these machines and maintain them. Canada has done this successfully many years ago and has helped invigorate their general aviation community and industry, and yet Australia, we haven't even looked at it. We need to look at adopting the US FAA administration's approach to things like Cessna SIDS. We have general aviation aircraft owners in this country who own Cessna aircraft that are forced to maintain these aeroplanes with prescribed processes of inspection and maintenance that were designed for Cessna aircraft being used for commercial purposes. But Australia took a unique approach and demanded that private aircraft owners apply these maintenance standards. And that the consequence of this is that Cessna aircraft owners in Australia have been hugely disadvantaged to a point where they pay extremely high rates of maintenance and upkeep on these aircraft. And Senator McDonald, you would know that right across regional Australia, the Cessna 182 and the Cessna 172 are the Toyota Hilux and the Toyota Land Cruiser for our regional communities. And these aircraft are used no differently to a farm vehicle or a truck to get people and supplies to and from the properties. But these Cessna aircraft have been made unaffordable because CASA took the decision to do something that nobody else in the world was doing. And we've paid a huge price for this. We also need to look slightly external to CASA as well. And we need to look at things like the ASIC card program. That how is it that Australia, the only country in the world that has not had an airliner flown into a high-rise building, adopted a aviation security card that clearly was designed for commercial aviation. And if you read the Transport Security Act, it's clear that the ASIC card was designed to be a mechanism to protect commercial aviation. And yet, because of a wording conflict within the drafting of that legislation, persons who hold a recreational pilot licence and a private pilot licence under the CASA system have been captured in an unintended way and subjected to having to renew these security cards and the costs and the imposts that all of this applies. Now, these are some of the operational issues that we see at the bottom end of the system. These things, and the reason I raise these things, is over the last 4.5 years, I've taken each of these issues to CASA on numerous occasions, and they've been thoroughly ignored. And so the decline of the Australian general aviation industry is not an accidental occurrence. It's an intentional occurrence, because CASA are aware that these things have been driving broad decline in our industry, but have been unwilling to either listen to industry or unwilling to even consider that they must change direction in order to stop the industry being forced out the back door. Now, the purpose of this inquiry, as I read it, was to question whether the legislative structure of CASA is fit for purpose, and whether the impacts of the way in which CASA is currently conducting its operations in alignment with that legislative structure is damaging the industry or improving the industry. Now, again, we're short on time, but I would contend, and it's our association's firm view, that we do not agree that the current legislative process is fit for purpose, and that CASA, as an authority that appears to operate quite disconnected from the government, meaning that the current structure does not permit the minister responsible for aviation to effectively direct CASA to do anything. CASA has become, by virtue of a direction of the Parliament, an autonomous authority that has power that at this point in time really has no checks and balances in place. We have, I'll quickly finish here, and I'll be happy to take some questions. And so we have a structure today in which we have this authority. We as an industry face enormous challenges in dealing with this authority, and I've performed a multitude of interviews across this past 6 months where I've allowed individuals who've come up against CASA and experienced the worst of CASA to talk about those experiences and their dealings. The common theme in just about all of these experiences and dealings is that once CASA decides that they are going to come after you, there is no help for you. We have an independent commissioner that reports through the CASA DAS and the CASA board. He's paid by CASA. There is no independence here. There is no commission that oversights the power that this authority wields. And so it's our view that the Parliament must address these concerns by redrafting the legislation and returning CASA to the Civil Aviation Safety Administration, removing its powers as an authority and placing the management of CASA back under the direct control of the Minister for Transport and the government, to ensure that the government and the minister has the powers to protect the aviation industry from suffering the abuses that are so prevalent, so clear, and so defined. I might end there, and if you'd like to direct some questions.
Yes, thanks very much, Mr. Morgan. You've covered quite a range of information there. Just before I hand this to Senator Patrick, I just want to clarify, when we talk about general aviation, it has been put to me that general aviation under the ICAO definition includes sport, recreation and flight training. And under that definition, CASA would say that general aviation is growing. Given that my experience is exactly as you've identified, the cost of operating exactly as you described, the aviation Toyota Hiluxes of regional Australia, and the number of those that are either shedded up or people are selling off because of the cost of complying with maintenance and regulation under CASA. Given that my direct observation is that planes are disappearing from those tarmacs, what would you say about whether or not general aviation is in decline or growing using the statistics that ICAO would use?
There is no question, Senator, that general aviation across Australia is in wholesale decline. And it is AOPA's firm view that CASA continues to play games effectively with its representation of what general aviation is and is not. The simple truth is that BITRA themselves produced a report that at their last survey period shows that out of a general aviation VH registered aircraft fleet, an applicable fleet, we can remove a few things like hot air balloons and some other stuff. Let's look at the sensible, what you would genuinely classify as a general aviation aeroplane, that number of around 8,500 aircraft, from those 8,500 aircraft that CASA are responsible for regulating, some 3,300 of these aircraft were no longer flying. Now, that's bordering 50% of the Australian VH registered aircraft fleet that CASA regulate no longer participating in aviation. Now, there is a huge problem here. And CASA claim that they've made the aviation industry safe. And Senator, I've heard you put this to Mr. Carmody directly, and I would make the statement again. They are achieving a safe aviation industry, but they're doing it because they are driving aircraft out of the industry, and they are claiming falsely that these aircraft are no longer participating because they're simply old aircraft. That's not true. That's not true. These aircraft are able to be maintained and operated for many, many, many more years to come, because aviation is such a great, safe industry that we service and we maintain aeroplanes, we inspect aircraft, and we replace parts where they need to be replaced. And so effectively, an aircraft can remain in service for an almost indefinite period of time as long as we keep that maintenance going. Where we are not able to keep aircraft flying in this country is that CASA have made the processes for businesses to be involved in parts manufacturing impossible. And Senator, I've interviewed parts manufacturers from around Australia who've gotten out of the industry because they cannot afford to design and manufacture a part and get that part approved under the CASA system. And they'll tell you, Australia has a huge manufacturing opportunity, but you just cannot navigate the CASA regulatory processes. They're too difficult. And so these companies are now going overseas. They're moving to America. They're taking all of that talent offshore because you can't work with the system that we have in this country.
That's shocking evidence. I'm going to throw to Senator Patrick.
Thank you very much, Chair. I actually really only have one question, but I would ask maybe that you provide the committee with perhaps on notice an assessment, or at least something that grounds your statement about the decline in general aviation. So you've mentioned one metric, which is registered VH aircraft, but yeah, perhaps if you could inform the committee with a short submission as to that decline, such that we are armed with solid evidence, that would be appreciated. I can see you're nodding, Mr. Morgan.
We have a submission which is prepared for the inquiry, and it is our intention to submit that after the hearing.
Okay, thank you. I just really have one question, and of course I've heard your evidence across a number of different committees in this place, and it was a question I asked McDermott Aviation, and that relates to the amendment to the Civil Aviation Act back in October 2019, so a year ago. Firstly, are you aware of that change in the regulation?
It was AOPA Australia that led that push to get that change.
Okay, and so the fundamentals of that regulation are that CASA, in making its regulations and its safety standards, must consider the economic and cost impact on individuals, businesses, and the community of the standards, and take into account the differing risks across different industry sectors, have you seen a change in the way in which CASA exercises its powers over those last 12 months in relation to that provision?
No, we have not. And in fact, what we've seen take place over the past 12 months is almost like a worsening of the situation. And I'd just like to discuss three specific examples which address the question as to whether CASA genuinely understand the cost impact of the rules that they are imposing on this industry and also their policies that are put on this industry. Now, one of these examples is an AOPA Australia member who is based in Queensland, who is currently navigating a really disgraceful situation, to say the least, in which he is an approved testing officer up in Queensland, and he provides services to the flying doctors and is quite essential to their overall safety and operation. And he found himself being questioned by CASA in relation to some training, a process of training that he was conducting, and he did what all responsible pilots and people in this industry do. He responded to CASA and said, well, look, I have no desire to want to be breaking the rules. If you require me to be working a particular way, I'm happy to comply with what you need. Tell me what you would like me to do. And they went through that process and there was an agreement. That wasn't good enough for CASA. They then continued after this individual and decided, well, we've considered that there's been a breach, even though no one's ever been injured, no one was ever put at a considerable risk. It was really a argument over a definition as to something that could be done. And again, Senators, I'm happy to provide an extensive brief on this as part of our package, which I would recommend that you do go through. But the net effect of this is that CASA decided that the best course of action to take with this pilot was not to encourage the fact that he worked with CASA and demonstrated that he was quite happy to meet their expectations and move forward in a safe manner. That wasn't good enough. They've now decided to take his approvals from him, effective at the start of next year, for 2 years, and put this poor bugger out of work. CASA are leaving the RFDS short of a critical person that provides safety to their organisation, and they have hammered this guy so hard that his only course of action now is to represent himself in the AAT, in which he is a pilot going up against barristers and legal professionals on his own to defend the fact that he is a highly respected, highly valued member of the senior aviation community, a trusted person of the aviation community, and he's now got to go to extreme costs to defend himself. Now, Senator McDonald, I've raised this particular issue with you, and you had offered to attend that AAT hearing. I today would like to invite all of you to attend that AAT hearing so that you get to see firsthand what a kangaroo court the AAT truly is, and just what it exposes the participants of the aviation industry to when they have to fight to protect themselves because there is no framework to protect them. They are fully exposed to an authority that regards its enforcement actions powers to be more important than simply encouraging safety and lifting the industry up. And as this member will attest, he has never in the process of any of this said to CASA he would not comply, and in fact did comply and said, I'm glad we've had the conversation, at least I know I'm doing exactly what you want, let's move forward. But instead of agreeing to do that and monitoring the situation and encouraging compliance, they've decided to come after him. Now, the reason they've come after him is one of the people that are involved in this case happened to be a former competitor of his from his home airfield, where the two of them really didn't like each other a great deal. But now this individual works inside of CASA within the construct of an authority and has power to wield, and there is no checks and balances to stop the conflicts being turned into abuses. And so that's one example where it really is disgraceful, but we as an industry have no power to stop this. And we go to the boards of CASA and we raise these concerns and the boards don't reply, the boards don't respond, they don't get involved. We go to our Deputy Prime Minister and we say, and I'm sorry, Susan, to raise this because I respect what you do enormously, but we do go to the Deputy Prime Minister on these issues and we say, these things shouldn't be going on. They're absolutely abuses of power. Our industry's being victimised and there's nothing. And so are the costs of CASA's regulations and policies being taken into effect in that case? It's a clear no, it's an F, it's a fail. Another example, I've got a 30-year-old pilot in Western Australia, and I see Glenn Still there, WA representative. I've got a young 30-year-old pilot in Western Australia, falsely accused of low flying, who denied ever being involved in low flying. The investigators themselves acknowledged he wasn't involved in low flying. That wasn't good enough. They have pursued this poor bugger, and because he dug in and decided to defend himself, the investigator accused him that his attempt to defend himself was making him look like he was not a fit and proper person, because how dare he question CASA? He was showing himself to be contemptuous because he was questioning the regulator. Now, this young man has decided to fight, got a lawyer involved, has spent a fortune, $20,000, $30,000 on legal fees for a 30-year-old person starting out in aviation to defend himself against false accusations, made applications to get information under FOI, and now CASA are interfering in the FOI process to stop him mounting a full and fair defence of himself. And yet we have no rights as an industry. And so when we question the argument, does CASA consider the costs of its regulations? No. Does CASA consider the costs of its policies? No. Is the legislative structure of CASA that allows them to be this authority, to impose these authoritarian enforcements, is it helping industry? No. Does it grow industry? No. The third example that I would raise for you, and by the way, there are many, many more of these examples, and I have to congratulate CASA because, by God, they are absolutely brilliant at pulling the wool on the Australian Parliament. None of this has got airtime. It has been so well kept and so well swept under the rug that the government, I don't even believe half the time, knows this stuff's going on. But when you really delve into it, you'll find these examples. But this third example is an absolute shocker. We have an aircraft manufacturer today that has spent the last 2 years being victimised on a level that I would never have believed imaginable in this industry. Their aircraft has been accused of being unsafe. CASA went to the extent of announcing to industry that the aircraft was unsafe, but CASA have not been able to produce one piece of paper that can explain why the aircraft is unsafe. Now, a year has gone past since they slammed a safety notice on this aeroplane. The manufacturer has pushed back hard, as anyone would, to defend themselves. And what has CASA done in the meantime? CASA decide, we don't like you, you're criticising us and you're pushing back, we'll make your life even harder. And this aircraft manufacturer can't get CASA to communicate. They can't get CASA to come forward and say, well, we've put a safety notice on because of A, B and C. And in fact, one of the reasons that CASA put a safety notice on this aeroplane is someone conducted a dodgy aircraft test flight that wasn't conducted to standards, was not conducted by a person who was duly licensed to conduct such a test flight, who wrote a report that the report has no standing because the person is not a test flight pilot. And yet CASA can't go back from its position because CASA does not know how to admit when it's wrong. So does CASA take into account the millions of dollars it's now cost this aircraft manufacturer? Of course not. That's not what's important to CASA. What's important to CASA is that they're right. They don't care if it damages the industry. They care if they look right. And so it brings into question this one most important fundamental. If CASA were the Civil Aviation Safety Administration, if CASA were under the direct management of the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister for Transport, and it were run like the safety authorities of New Zealand, if it were run like the safety authority of America, if it were run like the safety authorities in the UK, we would not be having these problems, because our minister could step in and the minister could simply direct that investigations, inquiries and reviews take place, and to stop the abuses of power. So this inquiry is important, Senator McDonald. I do thank you for taking this on, but I do caution to say this. This is a very complex issue. There is no possible way within the construct of 30 minutes that I can adequately, and to be honest, I didn't sleep last night. I probably might look a little bit tired, but I didn't sleep a wink last night. And Mary, who'll be up next, can attest to this, because I spoke to her this morning and I said, Mary, I don't know how I'm going to be able to convey the depth and the gravity of just how broken this system is in 30 minutes. And so what does AOPA Australia feel needs to happen? I can't see how anything short of a royal commission to deeply examine all of these issues and to allow all of these people across the aviation industry to come forward and to share their experiences in the way that their rights have been abused, their businesses have been abused, the impacts and damage this has had on their livelihoods, their incomes, their employment, their superannuation. It needs to come forward, and it needs a mechanism in which it can be properly examined and cross-examined, because we've had these inquiries, many of these inquiries have taken place, and I can only form the view that CASA laughs at the inquiries and laughs at the Senate committee. I can only come to that conclusion because I know what they say behind the scenes, and I know that there does not seem to be any substantive change, even though each year I've listened to Senator Sterle identify at times he's caught them red-handed. Senator Patrick, you caught Mr Carmody red-handed making false testimony about industry's purported supports. Nothing seems to change. So we do need a deep inquiry.
You have got a lot to say, which I appreciate and value, but unfortunately we are well over time. I do invite you to make any further submissions to the inquiry with anything that you don't believe has been covered off. Senator Patrick, are you right if we move on?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair.
All right. Mr Morgan, please go with the committee's thanks. I do appreciate and understand exactly what you're saying. It's very difficult to get across the industry in a short amount of time. So please go with our thanks.
Thank you.